The first thing I thought of when I saw the title of this conference, Linguistics, was writing. This doesn't come as much of a surprise given that I am what you would call a grapholinguist, which means my research focuses writing and literacy in all its facets, and from an interdisciplinary perspective, integrating questions from not only traditional descriptive linguistics, but also psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics, thus acknowledging the cognitive and social dimensions of reading and writing practices. In the call for papers, writing systems are mentioned, but pretty late in the list. Written literacy is 14th in the list of topics, script and writing systems 31st and second to last. In my opinion, this is striking and startling. Writing is a central modality of language, those languages that have writing systems, that is. So how come? The reason I argue is we take writing for granted. It's an important part of our lives, whether we are just language users or linguists. We rely on writing, but don't really think so much about it, which is already the first major point I want to make in this talk. Writing may be omnipresent, but it is still marginalized. It is a tool that helps us, simply put, do stuff, such as thinking about things, including language. Specifically, it has allowed us to externalize our ideas, organize and reorganize them. However, even then, what we are interested in mostly is these ideas, not how they are produced or presented and perceived. And that's despite the fact that, aside from sign language, writing is arguably the ultimate form of visual and visible language. How come then that it is so invisible? How come that as a subject, it always plays second fiddle to spoken language? A great way to conceptualize this is with the help of a metaphor. Writing is like a window that lets us look through at the language and the meaning, the thoughts, ideas behind it. And as I said, we routinely look through this literate window every day. We just don't look at the window. It's just a window, right? We take it for granted. It does its job, and the really interesting things apparently loom behind it. Crucially, sometimes we're not even aware we're looking through a window and completely disregard it, becoming oblivious to the fact that what we see is distorted or at the very least influenced by it being looked at through a window. When it comes to writing, linguists are guilty of that too, and what we know as written language bias refers to the fact that we use methods rooted in writing and literacy to describe language, including spoken language, without necessarily being aware of it. Well, but now there are grapholinguists like me, few, we are a rare species, if you will, and I wrote about the fact that many of us wouldn't even call themselves grapholinguists. But we do exist, and the study of writing is slowly but steadily finding its footing internationally. What if I told you, however, that one of the rather paradoxical circumstances of studying writing makes it a challenging enterprise, an enterprise that to some may even seem redundant, while the modality in which we do most of our research is, you guessed right, writing. It's like in order to look at the window, we must look through yet another window. We describe writing with the help of writing and also in writing. What else should we do? A thought that I had when working on my PhD thesis, where I tried to carve out a theory of writing and literacy, is that writing is its own description. Just look at the word description. It includes the word script. Describing writing means making sense of writing by means of writing. Or does it? That is what the remainder of this position/think piece will be about. Let us start with the materiality of writing, because within the study of writing, or grapholinguistics, as I'll call it from now on, there's also a hierarchy of what is studied more and what is relegated to the background. And as I said before, writing tends to become invisible to us, users and linguists. In terms of the window, we may analyze how the window functions, but disregard how it looks and how this, its appearance, may contribute to how it fulfills its functions, basically showing us language. But wait a minute, the medium is the message, right? That's not to say that linguists never thought about the materiality of writing, but for a long time when they did, they strangely looked at it in a dematerialized manner. How? Abstractions, abstract features. Sound familiar? I bet it does. Abstract features got their big break, especially in structuralist phonology, from where they spread to other sub-branches of linguistics. As one linguist said, the coining of some terms, as well as the establishment of certain concepts, such as the grapheme by analogy with the phoneme, were a reflection of the desire to have a piece of the cake that the success of a structuralist approach to language, especially phonology, offered. This, by the way, is also bizarre. The study of phonology, as by the way, of all science, if we think about it, is arguably also only possible due to the existence of writing. But even more so, some scholars claim that the way we think about speech, which essentially is a continuous stream of sound, as being made up of discrete segments, is made possible and fostered by segmental, that is, alphabetic literacy. The identification of phonemes as distinctive entities and their description in terms of writing was seen as a great discovery when, in fact, we just transferred something that writing offered us, segmentality, to a different modality for which it wasn't actually meant. Ironically, for writing as a research subject, these structuralist tools don't seem as flashy, or as mentioned before, they may even seem redundant. Writing, for example, doesn't need to be segmented. That's the very way it comes originally. And in terms of features, why describe the abstract features of an A, for example, when I can just print it and look at it for as long as I want? That makes a concrete instance of A the description of the category A, if it really were that easy. And spoiler alert, it isn't. A phoneme, on the other hand, isn't tangible. We can't even hear it, it's abstract. So describing it in terms of abstract features that linguists wrote a lot about in their publications helped seize this abstract notion. No such need for writing, right? Well, depends. A given instance of A that is actually produced and that you can see is a concrete graph, and always an allograph. Thus, it includes certain variation, as every allograph is merely a variant of the category. The category itself, abstract, in a way invisible. Let's call it basic shape. It's the skeleton of a written unit, and every one of its allographs is just one of infinite possible bodies or dresses. The dresses, such as specific handwriting or various typefaces, as seen here, in linguistics were quickly discarded as paralinguistic. They don't change the meaning of an utterance. Denotatively, that is. Everyone who has seen a gravestone set in Comic Sans knows that connotatively, appearance is crucial. But that's where sociolinguistics comes in, and in the beginning of a search for abstract features, we were yet far away from the moment sociolinguistics and the study of writing met. The search for abstract features in writing may seem paradoxical as we're reducing something concretely visual and stripping it down to its bare essentials, which can then be used to describe visual units. Why? One reason is finding commonalities, and there were quite a few linguists who were fascinated by the attempt to uncover abstract features in writing. An example is the attempt by German linguist Hans-Peter Althaus, who proposed two sets, a set of elementary forms that make up shapes and a set of spaces in the line that take up different amounts of space of or in it. Together, forms and spaces could be used to provide formulas for the shapes of Roman letters, like this one for P. The motivation or usefulness of this approach were not made explicit by Althaus, however. From the perspective of the description of writing, it is interesting to note that here it is graphic but not written in the narrow sense, that is, if you don't count digits as written units in the same way that letters are at least. What Althaus called features were actually parts or segments of basic shapes that are still concrete and not abstract. This also makes parts of his approach redundant. Some of the segments share features such as their curvature or their orientation. This is what was criticized by William C. Watt, a prolific semiotician who has published extensively on the description of writing, especially in a series of articles titled, "What is the Proper Characterization of the Alphabet?" In the first entry in the series, published in 1975, he laments that the conflation of visual segments of shapes and their features, and he himself opts for the features. In two distinct featural analyses that depend on whether shapes are produced or perceived, he establishes features such as the ones seen here in a formal description of the kinetic program involved in producing an uppercase K. While his work is impressive, the last entry in the series was published in 2015, it is little received and has an obscure aftertaste, even for die-hard grapholinguists like me. Why? It seems a bit like grunt work, as we may ask ourselves what the use of such analysis may be once we have achieved them. I argue that this question becomes a lot less pressing if we extend our view to include other scripts. meaning not just Latin script, which in Eurocentric linguistics was, of course, the main focus. Like in linguistic typology, we then hunt for commonalities that may uncover things about writing that are, in turn, of explanatory nature as they demand of us to find answers to why they exist. Why we humans keep producing the same things, in this case shapes, over and over again, independent of the time we live in or the culture we were socialized in. Such deep-rooted commonalities or even universal tendencies are arguably even more meaningful for the graphic modality of writing, as unlike for speech, here we really don't run into any articulatory restrictions. Simply put, while in speech we only can do as much as our body internal articulators will allow us to do, in writing there are not really any restrictions as to what we can do on a surface and with an array of writing instruments. The value of a linguistic approach to the visual diversity found in the world's scripts, here we saw just a few, was recognized by well-known linguist David Crystal, who proposed an international graphetic alphabet similar to the international phonetic alphabet. Interestingly, there we would find, according to him, shapes and not abstract features. Literally, our purpose would be identifying all the marks the human hand can make that are capable of playing a contrastive role in some language, the array of straight lines of varying length and orientation, curves, dots, thicknesses. Needless to say, such an international graphetic alphabet does not exist. This has a myriad of reasons, many of which I've already mentioned. The study of writing is still marginalized, meaning there are a few grapholinguists and specialists on different scripts who were trained in different philologies, such as Egyptology, Assyriology, or Mayan studies, often do not cross disciplinary boundaries, meaning valuable visual analyses never come into contact with one another. A descriptive grapholinguistics, and especially a description of written materiality, meaning the genuinely graphic and mostly visual aspects of writing, seem pointless to many. Writing is visual, is permanent, and due to its salience and omnipresence in our lives, everything about it seems so self-evident that linguists rather spend their time studying facets of spoken language or sign language. In other words, not least because writing is the modality with which linguists work every day to make sense of their findings and present them, it acquires the status of that window I had mentioned. It's just a metalinguistic lens through which we discover more mysterious and less palpable phenomena in language. And yet this completely disregards just how much writing can reveal to us about how humans are, to quote the call for papers for this conference, ocular-centric animals. Because yes, we definitely are that. Even more than that, probably, we are spatiocentric. Yes, writing is a linguistic modality, but as of now, we focused on its material substance, and for good reason, because it is in this substance that we find very salient reflections of how our brain works. Cognitive scientists, among them Stanislas Dehaene, have described how structures we find in scripts echo our brain's preferences and restrictions. Humans have been around for a long time, whereas writing is nearly a few thousand years old. This makes it too recent an invention for us humans to have adapted to it evolutionarily. Instead, it is writing that was conceived and, more importantly, changed in a way by us humans that made it something we could process easily and efficiently, paving the way for it advancing to a tool used daily for communication across time and space. Because of its recency, there are no brain regions specifically dedicated to writing. Instead, other regions were repurposed in what has been called neuronal recycling. That is how researchers have found that the spatial configurations observed in the world's scripts, how the parts of shapes are arranged in space and connected to each other, reflect configurations we also find in natural scenes, configurations our eyes thus perceive all the time and are familiar with, and that our brain, in turn, knows how to handle. One could thus even say that writing is a document of our visual processing. It reflects back to us the features that we can best handle. Another scientist whose argument I'm following here is Olivier Morin, who also stresses that next to our human nature, it is also culture that restricts shapes, which is a big factor when it comes to the sheer diversity of scripts that we saw before. Different cultures may use different materials, for example, whether palm leaves or wet clay, and different tools to write, leading to different shapes that may reflect in different ways our visual and also graphomotoric processing. Descriptive grapholinguistics, and especially graphetics as the study of the materiality of writing, thus becomes a cornerstone of a visual cognitive linguistics, or even more broadly, cognitive science. If only its obviousness and taken for grantedness wasn't standing in its way so much. And if only it were more linguistic in a traditional sense, right? Well, it may be. As the earlier mentioned Watt aptly argued, we humans tend to make systems of things, and we tend to make these systems more systematic over time. And since writing is not just a set of visual marks, but a set of visual marks related to specific languages, we also tend to strive for systematicity in these very relations. This is how we can indicate find types of iconicity or diagrammaticity in the world's writing systems, where similar shapes indicate similar linguistic values or functions. A system that is often called ingenious, in which this was designed on purpose, is Korean Hangul. The system in which some scholars, not uncontroversially, claim this has happened naturally and unconsciously over a long period of use is Latin script. Thus, we must also highlight a diachronic dimension to see how we have changed or optimized the systematicity inherent to writing over time. In conclusion, we must really start looking at this window. Just because we see writing and thus do not self-evidently need to describe it in terms of abstract features, this does not mean that we have already uncovered everything that precisely such a fine-grained analysis of its myriad facets would reveal to us. While an international graphetic alphabet seems unattainable, a description of how different scripts are structured now, complemented by a description of how they have historically developed to reach this stage, and, crucially, a subsequent comparison will be vital, granting us a clearer picture not only of our brain's graphic and visual constraints, but also the leeway that remains for variation, illuminating the dynamics between universality and diversity. This is obvious, but a window goes in two directions. For a long time, we have mostly looked outside to see what writing tells us about language and the world. And with the emergence of grapholinguistics, we have started looking at the window and about how it influences what we see behind it. Now we should start looking inside into what the window shows us about our minds and how they work. At the end of the day, this makes writing not only a taken for granted tool of research, but also a core subject of visual linguistics. Thank you very much for your attention.